Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and I'm going to tell you about my superpower. Uh, so, my superpower is that I can give people difficult feedback and usually have them leave the conversation feeling pretty good about it. Um, Part of it is that I value difficult formative feedback. I believe that it's important. And there's a few experiences I've had that have helped with that. One is that I went through a doctoral program in counseling psychology, and an important part of those programs is to give feedback. So there's a lot of difficult feedback along the way, but also there's once a year your faculty all get together and talk about you, and you get a letter about you from your advisor. And so there were several years where it's never a fun letter to read, but it's a time and a place to communicate things that are hard to communicate in other times and places. For example, I always thought that I had a face that people could read like a book. I got that feedback a lot when I was younger, that I should never play poker. But then one of the years, I don't even remember which one, I got feedback that in class I often seemed distant and that kind of my face was blank and it was hard for the professors to know what I was thinking. And that really changed the way I present myself. I think it's also important to have people around you who are invested enough to criticize you lovingly. I remember one of the things when I was doing grad school interviews, I was very nervous and I bought a suit, which you don't usually need to do for grad school interviews, I now realize. But I was trying hard. I didn't really know what I was supposed to do, and so I was just trying to guess at it. But I wanted to have something that felt more like me because the suit felt so not like me. And so I found these sparkly shoes, and they were like massive heels that are not actually a good idea. And they were sparkly, and I really, really liked them. And there was a person in my life who tried to tell me, like, maybe those aren't such a good idea. And eventually there was a point that she said, if you want to wear them, wear them. I think it's fine. And I was like, yeah, it's fine. And looking back, it was a silly thing. And I mean, I don't think it affected where I got in and where I didn't. But looking back, I value that person was willing to tell me gently and to eventually say, it's not that important. But to try to tell me that. That's kind of a silly and light example because this is recorded and I'm sharing only things that feel very comfortable to share with who knows who. I think it's also important to recognize that there are cultural differences in the importance of negative feedback. Western culture tends to emphasize more the value of, at least modern day, tends to value building self-esteem. Eastern cultures are more likely to say that it's really important that you kind of have a duty to your family to correct them when they're not doing something the right way, and to kind of solicit other family members to join in and say, you need to do this, that's kind of your duty as a family member. So sometimes there's different perspectives on how important this negative feedback is. Another piece that I'll add here with kind of that second point is that if I ever have a difficult conversation with you, it probably means that I care about you, because when I'm deciding whether to approach something, one piece is, is it just necessary? But another piece is, do I care about this student, and do I trust that this student is going to make good use of this information? So how do I do it? How do I have effective, difficult conversations? Part of it is that I use my helper voice. And this doesn't mean that I act like a therapist. It means I use that voice. So I express caring for the person. I am genuinely myself, even though, sometimes there's the inside voice and the outside voice. but it's still me. It's just the best version of me I can muster at the moment. Professional, that often means taking out some of those emotional words, taking out some of that judgment, wording things carefully. But another piece of it is one of the roles when you're a counselor or a helper is that you are always the most comfortable person in the room. No matter how uncomfortable the topic is, your job is to be the most comfortable person in the room. Because we talk about all sorts of very private, very difficult things, and it's important when your role is to be a helper, particularly a counselor or a psychologist, your role is to be available for whatever content the client wants to bring in. Now, if you're working customer service and someone brings up very personal, private information, it's a little more okay to say, that's not really my role here. So I want to make it clear, this class is not a become a doormat class. But when I'm thinking as a professional and a helper, part of my job is to be the most comfortable person in the room. And so, the same as when I'm doing a suicide assessment, which is never fun. There's never a time that it's fun to ask those questions. And there's never a time that it's easy either. It gets easier, but it doesn't get easy. Whether it's talking about someone's sex life or asking about abuse, these are all really difficult things, in different ways to ask about. Similarly, when I'm giving difficult feedback that I know is going to be painful and difficult for the other person to hear, it's important to me that I still have that focus on looking calm, even if I don't feel super calm inside. It's important to word things neutrally. I've talked a lot about how you do that, how you try to skim off those emotion words. And part of it is just practice. Part of it is rehearsal ahead of time. But it's also just generally learning how to substitute less biased language, less strong language. You word things as objectively as you can, what someone would see, what someone would hear that happened. So even as silly as instead of saying, you spilled the water, saying, the water spilled out of the cup. That difference makes a huge difference in the implied blame and responsibility. It's also important, part of what I do in those conversations is I give the person a way to save face. And that's part of my belief in phenomenology. So I believe that if I could fully see someone, if I could see the world through their perspective, what they did would seem reasonable. And so as I'm talking about what might have happened, I'll often suggest a few different things that could be the case. And I don't need to narrow down which one it was. So let's say I am meeting with someone to say that I believe that their paper meets the criteria for plagiarism and that I'm going to report it to the university. I might say, I know that sometimes you just make a mistake and you forget which writing is yours and which is someone else's. And sometimes you run out of time and you just get desperate and you make a poor decision. Typically, I don't really need to, if I am, in my classes, usually we've talked enough about plagiarism that the consequences are going to be the same either way. We don't need to hash out which one it is. So I can allow them a few different options, some of which are fairly socially acceptable. So I can say, I can understand how something like this might have happened, and it's unacceptable. We'll get to the and stance real soon. So you want to empathize with their perspective to say, I know that this class is really difficult. I know things are stressful. If you know specifics about a person's situation, you might mention those lightly. Recognize their efforts, so recognize whatever it is that they have done. So to say, I know that you've asked me to look over things in class a lot of times. So for this, I'm still kind of sticking with the idea of a plagiarism conversation because that's one that's fairly common and never fun. Never fun. So recognize anything they're doing that is in the direction you want it to be, even if you have to pull a little bit. Most of the time there are things that, it's fairly easy to find strengths and contributions that are good. So I really try to make sure that I want them to know that I still see them as a person. I see them as, not irredeemable. I try to isolate it as a mistake rather than who they are. I explain the problem. So here's what has happened. And I suggest some solutions. Sometimes there may be different ways we can handle an issue. Sometimes I'm going to say, this is what's going to happen next on my end. After that, here are some different things we can do. So with plagiarism, I might talk about, you could withdraw from the class and try again. You could, depending on the date. If it's on an earlier, if there's still assignments to come. So for example, writing in psych, usually there's an early paper and then the later paper builds on it. I would talk about, here's what I need to see from a later paper to not also report it for plagiarism, which is bad. 2 reports is really bad. So I would talk about what their options are, or I will usually say, you could choose not to turn in the final paper because you would have to essentially rewrite it. And so you could do, here's what would happen then. So I talk about a few options as much as possible. And I also talk about I make sure that someone understands what plagiarism is. So really making sure that they understand why this is happening and kind of brainstorm with them about what they can do in the future to avoid it. Because there's been 1 or 2 times that I genuinely did think it was a mistake, but it was a mistake where I had given them feedback a couple times and talked quite a bit about this is a danger that you need to avoid, and they still didn't avoid it. That's why you always paraphrase early instead of including quotes in your notes. So you explain the problem very clearly, but again, as neutrally as possible, and again, as something that could happen. Another piece of my philosophy is that under the right circumstances, anyone could be driven to just about any behavior. And so, although I might not plagiarize as quickly as some people would, I'm sure that there are places and times and situations where I would choose to plagiarize. So it's acknowledging, it's acknowledging that they're still a person and they may still be reasonable and have done this thing that's just not okay. So you want to explain what the problem is, suggest solutions or things to do differently in the future, and you really want to end with optimism, with this sense that I believe that this was an action that you can do better on in the future. That's pretty much it. We think a lot about feedback in sandwiches, so having good, not so good, good again. So that's part of how I think. I try to start with, here are your strengths, here's, and even that idea of using my helper voice and having neutral wordings, that's starting with this sense that we're together and we're aligned. Then giving the more difficult part of the feedback, but then making sure you end with, either explicit or implicit messages that I care about you, I think that there's hope for the future, and I want you to know that, there are things you can do to move forward. That's my superpower. Thanks.